So now I'm going to walk you through the three hypotheses for the assignment. And first I want to just scroll through the actual assignment document. Be sure that you are reading this carefully. If you follow directions, you're much more likely to get a good grade. I've made this nice table so you can write down what the answers are for the hypotheses, and also look through the book, look through the articles, find support for the hypothesis. Now, in some cases, this could be that our hypothesis is supported and research also supports it. In other cases, we might have a hypothesis that doesn't work out in our sample, but it's counter to what your book says. And you need to sort of speculate, why might that be? What is it about our sample that could make it that a typical, something you would expect between two variables doesn't work out? So I've just provided this so that you're sure that you have both the answer to the hypothesis as well as some science behind why we propose this hypothesis in the first place. We have three hypotheses. If you look at the rubric, you'll see exactly how I want you to write this up. I expect at least a 5-paragraph paper. In your introduction, you are going to talk about at least one major model of stress and talk about stress in the university students. Then this brings you to the body of the paper, where for each section you will talk about one of the three hypotheses. I am expecting that you are integrating references, like all my assignments, that provide the science or theory behind the information. And then finally, in the conclusion section, I want you to, in at least 2 paragraphs, summarize factors that were discussed in the first 3 sections through the hypotheses. Now, you do have an option for a bonus. If you feel proficient enough in SPSS to run something, then you can give that a try for an extra 2 points, but this is not expected. I'm not expecting anybody in the class to be able to use SPSS, since I'm not sure what type of training you've had prior to this class. So with that in mind, let's look through our data. So I'm going to go to the syntax and scroll down to get to the first hypothesis. We believe that people who are older and further along in their college career have more responsibilities and tasks and therefore have higher stress. So we're going to look at this in 2 ways. First, we're just going to look at the correlation between age, perceived stress, and the undergraduate stress questionnaire. Remember with correlations that we are looking at direction and magnitude. Direction would be whether the correlation is positive or negative. So we, in this hypothesis, are expecting a positive correlation because with higher age, we would expect higher stress. Now, a negative correlation, an example would be if we flipped this hypothesis and said that we thought that younger people had higher stress. Magnitude is how much we see a relationship between these two variables. So correlations go between -1 and 1. If you have a correlation of 2, you made a mistake. If you had a correlation of -1.5, you made a mistake. Correlations are always bounded between -1 and +1. So something of high magnitude would be -1 or +1, or -0.9 or +0.9. And this means that for a 1 increment increase in one variable, we're seeing a very similar increment increase in the other variable. In psychology, we don't see correlations of that high of a magnitude because there's a lot going on. We can't explain your stress just by your age. So we would expect something more around 0.3, 0.4. So let's see what we have with our correlations between stress and age. So this is the correlation matrix. Now you'll notice that it is the same on the bottom and the top. It's repetitive. So let's just look at 1. Well, we do see a significant correlation. So see, our p-value is less than 0.05. In fact, our p-value here is less than 0.001. That's a nice magnitude for a psychological study, and this is saying that there is a significant correlation between how many stressors somebody is going through in our class and their perception of those stresses. That wasn't one of our hypotheses, but that's something that we should expect. So let's look at our hypothesis of age. We see that there's actually a negative correlation. So people who are younger are demonstrating higher stress, but if you look at the p-value, this is not significant. So our hypothesis is not supported. There doesn't seem to be a relationship between age and stress. So what have you read about in your textbooks, or what kind of article could you find that would describe why in a university sample there isn't much of a relationship between age and stress? But let's look at another way we could approach this, and that's through a t-test. Now, a t-test will compare the means of two groups. So in contrast to a correlation where we have variables that are continuous, we have to have at least one variable in a t-test that is dichotomized, or that has two different groups. So in this case, I've split it up to compare our sophomores and juniors to our seniors. So another way we could think about this is that our seniors, they have the stress of finishing out their degree, worrying about what's happening next year, worrying about paying their student loans next year. So maybe being a senior somehow makes you have higher stress. So let's check that out. And we're running this for both perceived stress and for the undergraduate stress questionnaire. Okay, so first let's look at our perceived stress, and you can see the mean comparisons. So our sophomores and juniors, they're 33 in the sample, and their mean is 39.4 on perceived stress. And for our seniors, we have 56 in the sample, and the mean is 38. Now there's not much of a difference, so it's unlikely this is statistically significant. And sure enough, we see our t-score right here, and see our significance level. That is above 0.05, which means that this is not statistically significant. And similarly, we see that for our undergraduate stress questionnaire, the means are similar for our two groups, and the t-score is non-significant. So again, hypothesis one, whether you're looking at the correlation between age and stress, or you're looking at these different groups and stress, there is not a significant difference. So how could you explain that? Now let's move on to hypothesis two. And for that, we're looking at the correlation between coping, perceived stress, optimism, and humor. So our hypothesis is people who are more optimistic and use humor more will have lower stress and report better coping. So you've read about optimism and humor in your chapter, and how that could be helpful or might be a barrier to problem-focused coping. So let's see what we found in our data set. So first, here are the different modes of coping. Remember this, there are 8 different subscales, and then perceived stress. And we look at the correlation. Now this is pretty overwhelming, isn't it? So I recommend that you just look at one column, and that is this column right here, because we're interested in, let me slide this over a little bit so you can see it all. We're interested in humor and how it relates to the different ways of coping, and then also with perceived stress. So if we look at this column, we see that there is a significant positive correlation for some of the ways of coping and humor. So if you look at these different ones that are significant, we have the positive reappraisal is significant, planful problem solving, seeking social support, self-controlling. So those are the subscales that came out to be significantly related to humor. So why might that be? Look at the items of these different subscales to try to formulate a rationale and pull in information from the textbook to explain this relationship. And then finally, we see that there's a negative significant correlation, so p is less than 0.05, between humor and perceived stress. So people who have a higher perception of stress are using humor less. Now the second part of that hypothesis is looking at optimism. So do we think that we're going to see a similar pattern with optimism as we do with humor? So again, we'll scroll over to this last column. This is the optimism scale. And you'll see that we have some positive relationships that are significant with coping, and then we have some negative ones that are significant as well. So it seems that coping is somehow related to optimism for some scales, but is negatively related for other scales. So be sure that you're carefully looking at this output when you're writing up this hypothesis and looking at the items for these different measures. Now let's see with optimism and stress. Similar to humor, we see a negative relationship with perceived stress. This is P is less than 0.001. So people who have greater optimism have less perceived stress. So hypothesis 2 had some nice support for it in our data set, and I hope that you can use this to really draw in that information from the textbook, from different readings, to explain why you think this is. Now finally, this is a critical hypothesis for health psychology because we think that these psychological variables are related to physical symptoms. So think about how we see the biopsychosocial model really entwined throughout these hypotheses, where we're talking about social support, we're talking about psychological functioning, and then also biological functioning. So do you think that people who have more stress and are enacting some of these less effective means of coping, do they report more physical health symptoms? And we're doing a correlation table for that. Okay, so let's look down this last column where we're looking at physical symptoms. This is significantly related to, to 3 of these 4 coping scales that are indicative of maybe some less effective coping mechanisms. And then we see that there is a significant relationship between perceived stress and undergraduate stress questionnaire. Now, remember, I told you that we don't see really high magnitude correlations a lot in psychology because there's so much going on. But look at this magnitude right here of 0.7. There is a strong correlation between people, how much stressors you're going through, and the physical symptoms that you're reporting. We also are seeing a pretty nice magnitude in terms of perception of stress and physical symptoms. There is a lot in your textbook that you can use to back up this hypothesis, and it's really interesting that we're able to see this in our sample. So in about 100, so this is our sample size right here. So in about 100 university students who have signed up for Health Psychology Online, this is the conclusion that we can come through. Good luck in writing this up.